Happy Monday, everyone. Looks like we made it to the start of another week here on Cozy Horror with me, Dr. Plague. Let's get your week started right with another 5 stories to really help you make it through this Monday morning. Today's topic of discussion is strange writers, which is something I have a little bit of experience with. So let's start off right with a tale about a mass murderer, a killer, an absolutely cold-blooded ender of lives. But it's okay, because it's just the ending of a storyline. Or is it? Let's learn a little more about whispers.
I am a murderer. I'm responsible for the deaths of 75 within 2 weeks. I've stabbed men to death, rendered bodies to ash, killed children in the womb, and even drowned whole ships at sea. I've changed the fate of kingdoms and seen to it that uncharted planets remained unfound. I would likely be the most prolific serial killer in the United States, if not for one problem. The police claim that if murdering fictional characters was a crime, they'd have to jail Stephen King and George R. for multiple life sentences. They say this as they laugh me out of the police station. They think it's a joke, or that maybe I'm not right in my head. But I can assure you, I'm as right as I've ever been. I listened to them tell their stories for years, and I've heard them scream when I end their lives. I'm a murderer, pure and simple, and their blood is on my hands. You're probably reading this, though, and thinking that I'm ready for the rubber room. Let me start from the beginning. I've always been a creative mind. When I was younger, I could hear them whisper to me about their homes, their verdant green kingdoms, their sterile, majestic spaceships, the feel of rolling decks beneath their feet, and so much more. It manifested in my games, and my school friends would always gather around to see what today's adventure would be. We traveled the cosmos, fought wars between elves and men, and roamed imaginary prairies as we hunted wrongdoers on horseback. As I grew older, the voices grew louder, more insistent, and their stories became my stories. I wrote about the kingdoms of my youth, the adventures of my childhood, and by the time I was 20, I had 5 books published, even one on the New York Times bestseller list. As I grew, so grew my fame. My writing was prolific, and all the while the voices told me their stories. I took my readers to fantastic places, and their patronage allowed me to live quite well. By the time I was 30, I had a home and a family and enough published work to fill a bookshelf. That's when the problems started. It all started with Aberdeen Price, dashing archaeologist adventure. He told me of his next adventure, a trip to the city of Bone. However, I was working on something else at the time, and didn't want to divert efforts away from my current project. So I wrote some notes and promised myself I would sit down and give him some time when I was done. This apparently wasn't good enough for Aberdeen. He came every night in my dreams and told me his story over and over and over again, until finally I just couldn't take it anymore. I stopped what I was doing and diverted all my attention to writing his next book. It was a hit, a bestseller, and the biggest mistake of my life. You see, this showed the voices that they could get what they wanted by badgering me. Every night from that night on, they would come to me and tell me their stories, each overlapping the other, until I just couldn't take it anymore. The kingdom of Verdant Green was once at the mercy of the dark wizard Zormoth. His evil armies threatened to... Scanners once more alert Kevin Gorel that he is nearing his destination. The dark planet Zephyr rises from the darkness of space as he see the island of Katmandil off the starboard side of Elizabeth's Folly. The shore is quiet, but Captain Cree can once again see the natives amongst the trees as he hears his quarry. The elusive Dr. Burton will strike again this night, and I will be ready to... Their voices towered in my mind like the screams of children as they tried to make themselves heard. That was my first mental breakdown, and my worst. My wife arrived home in time to save me from bleeding to death. They put me in an institution for 3 weeks after that. Lisa thought it was all the strain of my busy writing schedule. The strain of writing so much must have just become too much for you, she said, as she stood by my bedside and looked down with pity for her poor, brilliant husband. She had no idea. The worst part wasn't the IVs or the sedatives, the shitty TV, or the staying in a room for 24 hours a day, the sounds of sorrow from down the hall, even the constant itching from the healing cuts on my arms. It was the week and a half I spent with my hands in restraints. Without my hands, I couldn't write. Without writing, there was no way to stop the shrieking harpies in my brain from driving me insane. It took me a while to convince them that writing was a kind of therapy for me. The battle was made all the harder by my wife's constant arguments about how the writing had put me here in the first place. After a week and a half of no change, they had begun to see that I might be making some sense. I began to write again, and the changes were noticeable. I started sleeping, became less hostile, finished my meals, and a month later I was ready to go home. The voices started ramping up again almost immediately. By this point in my career, I had 7 stories running on and off. That's a lot of voices trying to be heard. I tried to keep up with them, but I could feel my sanity slipping again as they screamed for my attention day and night. By my second week home, my wife was ready to have me committed all over again. I'd stop sleeping and would lock myself in my study for days to make the voices stop for even a few minutes. That was when my first murder took place. That's not to say that no one had ever died in my stories. Characters die in stories. That's the nature of storytelling. But this was the first time I'd ever deviated from the path set forward by the voices. Detective Sam Umbridge was coming to the climactic end of his latest crime novel, and the shootout with the killer was becoming heated. I had meant to write that Dario West, the antagonist of the novel, was struck by Sam's bullet as he leaned around the doorframe. Before I knew what I'd done, though, I had written the death of beloved gumshoe Sam Umbridge instead. I had moved on to the next sentence before I caught my error, but it was too late by then. He died in my head with a gut-wrenching scream, and just like that, his voice was mercifully silent. For a moment, all the voices were silent. It was as though they had all seen what I had done in my manic state. I cleaned up the draft a little bit before sending it off. Sam and Dario had killed each other in the shootout, and Sam had died victorious. Fans hated that Detective Sam Umbridge would never make another appearance on their shelves, but they accepted it. The end was widely praised by fans and critics alike, an all-around success. My agent even called to congratulate me on the climax of a much-beloved series, and asked if everything was going all right with me. Last time we talked, you sounded as though you were a little shell-shocked. I guess I wasn't shocked now that I think of it. The process really made me think. Why not kill what was driving me crazy? I didn't have to kill them all, just enough of them to make the voices quiet down a little. Like any prolific serial killer will tell you, it's hard to stop once you've started. Before I quite realized what I'd done, I'd ended them all. I ended my 8-book fantasy series with the death of the entire court and the eventual fall of the protagonist in his order. I watched as Kelvern Gorel flew his ship and crew into the phantom night, where certain doom awaited, and he would never be heard from again. After sinking the ship of his arch-rival, I had the Spanish Armada sink Elizabeth's Folly with all hands aboard, while Captain Cree floated atop the waves after taking a sword to the belly. I dropped a tomb on the head of Aberdeen Price, the one who had started my descent, and made the ruins he was exploring his own tomb in turn. I killed them all, one by one, and the fans were livid. How could you just kill them? Why wouldn't you simply end the series on a high note? Why did they all have to die? I toyed with the idea of ending their series, but I knew that it wouldn't work the moment I thought of it. They were never my stories in the end. They were only my stories to tell. If I left them alive, they would always want one more adventure. Killing them was all I could do to stop my descent into madness, and as I lay down to sleep that night, I felt myself smile at the thought of my long-awaited sleep. It never came. I've been staring at my sleeping wife for the past 7 hours as I keep court with the whispering dead. Their spirits are unwilling to die, the part of my soul I put inside them reluctant to be put to rest. It's only now that I see the folly of my actions. The dead, you see, are not to be satiated with adventures or the continuing joy of existence. They moan, they wail, they bemoan the lives and the loves that were taken from them. At first, it was only for me that I wept. Now I see that this curse won't end with me. You see, I was watching my daughter as she played in the park yesterday. She played in the sandbox, her dolls and her brother's action figures out on an adventure of her own creation. I watched her going about her games of make-believe as I sat in a daze. When I asked her about it over lunch, she told me a story about knights and castles, people hunting for dragons, and brave warriors protecting those in need from harm. It was a story just like the ones I had made up as a kid. The kingdom was similar to the one I had left in ashes. I beg you, anyone out there who hears the whispers, don't pass the gift to others. It must end with us, and never darken the mind again. I must keep my own vigil now. I must watch my own daughter now, before the madness takes hold. I can't let the whispers have her too, even if it means the death of another of my creations. I won't let the madness have her.
It's always terrible when you've got to bring a good series to an end. Feels a little like murder when you get right down to it. Coming up next, we have a writer trying to meet a deadline. He's trying to work on the next great American novel, but there's something that's distracting him, something that's making it difficult for him to reach his goal. Let's hear a story about the hollow clatter of chimes. I sipped my coffee and stared at the half-finished page in the mouth of my old Underwood. 3 days. 3 days, and this was what I had to show for it. I put my head in my hands and leaned back in the squeaky old office chair that had been here when I arrived. I couldn't get my mind on my work today, and that was a big problem. I'd rented the cabin for 2 weeks. 2 weeks of bliss away from screaming children and honey-do lists, and now I was 3 days deep with nothing to show for it but 3 paragraphs and writer's block. Smooth jazz caressed me from the speakers of my little CD player, but today its chords might have well been breaking glass. The wind blew outside, kicking up leaves against that glass, and as the jazz played on, I heard it again. There was something else under the surface of that jangling wind, the rattling sound that had been breaking my concentration for the last 3 days. A maddening, almost skeletal sound that wouldn't stop. I turned back to my work, but within minutes I had stopped again. The story was supposed to be about... What the hell was the story supposed to be about again? A horror writer in the woods, or something cliche like that. It had all seemed so well put together when I'd driven up here 3 days ago. A writer in the woods, writing his story, while something supernatural lurks around him, making his stories come to life. I tapped absent-mindedly at the keys for a few more minutes before I growled and yanked the paper out of the Underwood, throwing it in the garbage can. The Underwood was a vanity, and I knew it. I own 3 computers, one of them a very nice and very expensive MacBook. But I used the Underwood because it made me feel like a professional. Someone had told me at a convention or a book signing or something that real writers use typewriters. So I went out and paid an excessive amount of money for this ancient engine of destruction. Took a lot of money to keep this golem up and running, too, but I paid it, toting this heavy thing around in a case that was half as expensive as it had been, and felt that my writing was better for it. It would not have shocked me to learn that many writers had similar totems. The wind scuttled through the trees again, and this time I jumped when the leaves spattered against the window. It sounded like someone throwing a fistful of rocks against the glass, but that wasn't what had surprised me. I had been listening for that clattering sound, the almost musical knocking that sounded so familiar, and the sound of the skeletal leaves had caught me off guard. I cursed as I pulled the half-started sheet and threw it away. I had laid across the keyboard in my panic, and now it was ruined. I drew another sheet down into the guts of the old contraption and began to write again, getting a little further this time as I sipped my coffee, becoming quite happy with the results. The mountain path ran up and up and up as he scaled the climb and made his way to the cabin near the top. The snow lay like delicate lace upon the ground, and the tires of his Dodge Charger crunched into the snow as I stopped. A Charger? The writer hadn't had a Charger in the other writings I'd done. The Charger was mine, a big black brute that now hunkered outside the cabin as I wasted time inside. What was the writer driving again? He couldn't have gotten a Charger up here in the snow anyway. The car was great for highways and gravel roads, but snow and hills would have left it parked and waiting for more favorable conditions. I considered leaving it, but it just wouldn't do. I dragged out the correction tape and changed it to Jeep instead. Still, I wish the writer could experience the bliss of owning something I had wanted since I was a kid. The car out front had been a present, a reward for good service, which hadn't stopped my wife from complaining about it. "Really, a muscle car? That's so like you, Derek. Leave it to you to publish a book and have a midlife crisis all in the same week." She didn't get it, though. This had been a reward when my first novel had sold 500,000 copies. I'd paid cash for it on the lot and felt like somewhere in my past, a 12-year-old version of myself was grinning and pumping his fist. My old man had wanted a Charger, had talked longingly about getting one anytime he saw one, but he had been a welder for a rinky-dink construction outfit and had disdained books almost as much as he disdained his poof of a son for writing them. Well, now Dad was in the ground, and look who was screaming down the road in a Charger. I changed my mind again. The car stayed, and changed it again before moving on. Pulled his bags from the car and walked to the cabin. 2 weeks of peace and quiet to finish his book. 2 weeks of just him and his old typewriter in the picturesque cabin. Going up had been an adventure, but going down again would be suicide, and he only meant to tempt fate once. For better or worse, he was up here for 2 weeks. He had enough food, smokes, whiskey, and toilet paper for 14 days, and if it ran out, then he supposed he would just have to do without. His editor said his new book had to be ready before October, or he might as well shelve it forever, and he meant to have it ready. I nodded as I took the sheet off the typewriter, liking where this was going. The writer was at the cabin now. That was a start. Now I just had to get the rest of it. I wished my editor had told me I only had 2 weeks to write my latest mediocre piece of trash. My editor was a nice guy, but he was definitely more than a little spineless. He was more than willing to wheedle and kiss ass when what I really needed was a good boot in the backside. A deadline or an ultimatum might have motivated me more than what I actually had going on. It hadn't been a deadline, but due dates that pushed me to get to work on the book. The car was paid off, but the house was still a work in progress. Money from my first book was also beginning to run dry. The cabin had been an expense that I didn't really have, but if it birthed another book, then I suppose it was worth it. The wind hit the side of the house again, and I heard those unsettling wind chimes bang together for the 1,000th time. I couldn't figure out where they were. I hadn't seen any wind chimes when I came in, or I would have taken them down after the first night. At first they'd been a little interesting, but As time passed, they became downright grating. They were different from any wind chimes I'd ever heard. It didn't sound like metal, but it didn't sound like wood either. It sounded hollow, kind of like the leaves that kept rattling against the glass. The first night they had woken me up more than once. When I did sleep, it had come into my dreams, and the dreams would have made a good book all their own. Someone knocked, and I jerked a little as I went to see who it was. I was honestly a little glad for the distraction, ready to chalk this whole thing up as a wash the longer it went on. Seemed like I was honestly just looking for a reason to take a break, and I worried I wouldn't have anything to prop up the cost of this trip. My wife was going to have a fit, very likely, but I think the bigger disappointment would be that I didn't have a book for her to proofread. Melina had loved Feist, my first book, and it had held us together through some of the rougher times. She, not my editor, had pushed me to finish it, and I'd seen her read the battered old hard copy I'd gotten for Christmas a lot during our marriage. That was why I had to finish this one so desperately. I needed to remind her that I could still be the man that she had fallen in love with. The man on the other side of the door seemed relieved when he saw me, and I opened it with what I hoped was a friendly greeting. James had been hesitant to rent me the cabin, despite the good weather we'd been having, and it had taken a little coaxing to get the story out of him. We'd been corresponding for a month before he let me make a reservation, and the first night here, after a couple of handles of good whiskey, he had told me the reason. It appeared I wasn't the only one who had rented the place to get some work done, and the last guy had left him holding the bag in more ways than one. I came to check on him pretty regular, but one day, he just wasn't here. His truck was here, his stuff was here, but he was just gone. They never found him, but I keep looking for him when I go on my hikes sometimes. He didn't seem to like the sound of the weird wind chimes either, and he couldn't tell me what the sound was. "Hey," he said, his smile only slightly worried. "Just coming to make sure you didn't need anything. I brought some wood, too. They say there might be a blow-up tonight, and I didn't want you to freeze up here." I looked outside, craning my neck as if I expected to see the words "snow" written in the sky by some huge hand. "In September?" I asked, thinking he must be joking. He shrugged. "It happens some years. The weather here is temperamental, so do you need anything?" I shook my head. "I think I'm all set. I've got enough supplies for a month at least." That had been by design. Once I came up here, I didn't want to do anything but write and sleep and exist. Clearly I was making a botch of one of those things, but this guy didn't need to know about that. He nodded. "Well, if you need anything, let me know. I've got an old snowmobile if you get stuck up here, but I don't think it'll be that bad. Your car looks heavy enough to make it down, even if it snowed a foot of powder." I nodded, resisting the urge to tell him it was a Charger, and we parted ways. I gave it another half hour in front of the Underwood before shaking my head and going to get the whiskey I'd brought with me. Sometimes great writing needed a little lubricant. All the great writers knew that. That was why most of them had been drunks. A couple of handles in, and I was ready to write. I got back to work as the sun set behind the smeary windows. As I walked the writer through the setting up, I must have hit a hard head of steam because I started really banging it out as afternoon stretched into evening. I had a couple more glasses of whiskey, and as the paper got harder and harder to see, I found the pages were stacking up. The rattling kept right on coming, but I was too drunk to care. The juices were flowing, and when I slipped sideways halfway into my 6th or 7th glass, I saw something hitting the window as I passed out. They were small, the white flakes looking very wet as they slapped against the glass, and I slid sideways. They were small, the white flakes looking very wet
as they slapped against the glass and slid sideways. I hadn't really had a lot of experience with snow, but I remembered something like this from when I was a kid. The snow hadn't stuck, but I had laid in bed watching it hit the window as my nightlight had thrown soft light across the glass. I lay there in a stupor and remembered that, and when the wind chimes came again, hollow and ethereal, I remembered something else. I remembered watching something on TV, a 5-tet of dancing skeletons as they wiggled and wobbled in the autumn air. Somehow I imagined that the sound I heard would be like that. The sound of hollow bones banging against each other would make a sound like that. But the more I tried to fix on it, the foggier the dreams became. Finally, as my drunken dreams usually did, I was suddenly awake, and I'd traveled through time to a new place and a new when. I was shivering on the floor of the cabin, the inside suddenly very chilly, and the snow against the windows making the insides shadowy. It was sometime in the mid-morning, after dawn but before lunch, and the drift was up to the lip of the windowsill. I guess it had been more than a few inches, and as I staggered to my feet, I looked out and saw that my charger was covered in snow up to the door handles. Jesus, it had just dumped 3 feet overnight. Luckily, I had wood and bottled water, so I got myself a drink to cut the sharp edge of my hangover and got the fire going in the fireplace. As the snow rattled against the window and the hollow chimes continued to clang together, I sat down to look over what I had written. For drunken ramblings, it was pretty good. They were almost on topic, too, all of them laying out the strange sound that kept assaulting the writer as he worked. Wasn't the direction I'd intended to go, but I liked what my drunken self had put together so far. He sat at the keys, fingers ready for battle, but as they went to work, he heard the sound of it as it scraped across his nerves. It was a hollow clunking, the sound of old plastic bottles falling downstairs. And as the wind outside pushed at the house incessantly, the sound continued. It was a mystery at first, something he chased, but soon it would become maddening. That was pretty good, I reflected. The writer went looking for the sound, but couldn't seem to find anything. There were no chimes on the porch, front or back, and there were none hanging from the eaves. He checked the ragged trees around the house and even looked under the porch, but he couldn't find anything. There were no wind chimes anywhere. And that was when he noticed the window. Window? I said, flipping the page. What window? This story had taken a turn I hadn't planned on, but now he was talking about windows. The cabin he was in was supposed to be a single story. No upstairs to have a window. Of course, I hadn't meant to give the guy a charger either, and now he had one. The story was taking on a mystery feel, and I found that I liked it. I sat back down to write, feeding more paper in, but as I clicked away at the keys, I found that the threads just wouldn't come. It wasn't the story I had in mind, and now it was going off into uncharted waters. I tore a few pages out and tossed them, grunting as the light cut into my vision, and by noon I was looking at the half-empty bottle again. Maybe a little of the old inspiration could be found in its depths. 3 shots later, and I was off again. The window was important. There was someone in the window. He could see them, but he didn't know how to get there. There were no stairs, no way for anyone to get up there, so how were they there? I took another shot and kept writing. Suddenly, the cabin I was in and the cabin I was writing about were one and the same. There was a stranger in the cabin, someone lurking in the walls, and the writer felt like if he didn't find them, then they would surely drive him crazy. They were the ones making the noise. They were responsible for the hollow chimes, and if he wanted to keep his sanity, then the writer needed to find them. I passed out again that night, waking up in the morning with an even nastier hangover and about 20 pages of new material. I could get used to this whole getting drunk and waking up with pages deal. The writer had continued his own book, a book within a book, but his mind kept wandering to that person in the upper story. He had called the realtor he had rented the place from, but the man had assured him that the window was aesthetic. There was nothing up there. The writer didn't believe him, and reflected on a story the man had told him about another writer who had gone missing in the house, a writer who had gone missing under mysterious circumstances. He'd been working on his novel, a long mystery that he seemed to be making progress on, when he suddenly vanished. His truck was there, his things were there, but he was gone. I searched for him, but there was no sign. He kept a journal, and the journal talked a lot about strange sounds that he had heard when the wind blew. It was the rattling, hollow clatter of chimes, and the writer became quite mad. The realtor said this, and he had found holes in the walls where the man had gone searching for them, and he had charged the man's estate for the damages in his absence. I hoped the guy who had rented me the cabin wouldn't mind that I borrowed his story, but it was really coming along now. I had some idea where it was going, and one look outside told me I wasn't going anywhere. The snow was up to the porch now, and I had to force the door open to go check on a theory. As the house in the story became the house I was staying in, at least in my mind, I wanted to see if there was a window out there. Maybe I was working elements of real life into my tale, and as I tromped through the snow, I was a little relieved to see that there was no window over the porch. The roof rose into a upside-down V, and though there might be an attic up there somewhere, it wasn't big enough for a room. I started to go back inside, but something told me to walk around a little bit. I'd made a full circuit of the house and was heading back to the front porch when my foot came down on something and sent me sprawling. It had been small and slippery, the object rolling out treacherously as I turned, and as I lay there in the snow, I looked up and found the window. It was round, not a bay window like I had talked about in the story, and as I squinted, I thought I could see something up there. It was subtle, a dark outline, but it was definitely person-shaped. I reached down into the snow to see if I could find what I had slipped on, and came up with a cracked but still intact shot glass. The idea that I had come out here before the snow was very deep seemed to make sense. I'd come out here while I was drunk and looked at this window, and that was why it had stuck so fast in my mind. I'd seen it, seen the person-shaped shadow, and my mind had started running. It had been like that with Feist, too. I had seen something, a little dog hunting ground squirrels one afternoon, and my mind had raced along like one of those little squirrels. I spent the next 3 days writing, drinking, and nursing my pounding head in the morning. By the end of the first week, I had my story, but not my ending. The snow didn't melt, but it didn't grow any faster after that night. It froze into a tightly packed little hillock, and my expedition outside was very chilly. I could have driven through them if I had needed to get out, but going down the mountain with 3 feet of snow on the ground would have been close to suicide. The radio had said the snow would melt before it was time to leave, so I took it as a sign to just keep writing. The writer, my writer, had found the journal of the writer that had gone missing. It was hidden behind some books in the reading nook, and he had immersed himself in the man's ramblings. The writer was being slowly driven crazy by the sound of the wind chimes, but he believed that they were talking to him as well. They wanted to be found. They wanted to tell him a great secret. And as he searched for the secrets of the cabin, so did I. I started looking for a way into the attic. It had to be somewhere, but the house was devoid of any of the usual loft entrances I was used to seeing. There were no ceiling entrances, no pull-down ladders, and as my time began to wane, I thought of something I hadn't. Taking a leaf from the Scooby-Doo notebook, I started looking for secret entrances. The book had ground to a halt, the writer stuck trying to find his own way into the secret room, but I figured once I discovered the source of the wind chimes, I would have my ending too. I was starting to consider making some holes in the wall myself when I noticed something I should have right away. By the reading nook, there was a portion of the ceiling that was curved. It curved up, the rest of the ceiling being mostly flat, but it was enough to notice that this would be the most obvious place for a stairwell. I started moving the bookcase, sliding them to the side as I looked for the source, and was rewarded with a doorway. It was so seamless that I could believe that no one had found it. Maybe even the guy who had rented it before me had known about it, though that seemed like a stretch. The doorway squalled on rusty hinges as it came open, and I took the stairs slowly and deliberately. If someone was up there, then they would have surely heard me. But I suppose they already knew I was down there. As I came to the top, I froze as the person shape came into view. They were standing about a foot from the window, just staring in the direction of the muted light. And the longer I looked, the more I realized they weren't standing. The person would have had a hard time standing, especially in their condition. They moved ever so slightly as the wind came in through the eaves, and as it did, I heard the hollow sound of the chimes. They swayed to and fro, their bones held together with the thinnest of tendons, and some of the bones on the ground showed that they had been falling apart as time went by. I closed the hatch and called the man who had rented the cabin to me. I had to let him know that I had found the writer. Turned out I would be leaving on time, but I'd have to finish the book at home. The police had a lot of questions, as did the guy I rented the cabin from. For starters, he was unaware that the place had an attic. He had inherited it from his uncle and had done little but rent it out for the last 5 years. When the guy had disappeared in it last year, he had just assumed he had wandered off in the woods, but it appeared that the writer had discovered the secret passage and how to close it behind himself. They had found the writer's screenplay in the attic, along with his body, the body that I had been hearing all this time. He was little more than 4 arms, leg bones, and rib cage now, but his body had deteriorated until his bones were being held together by the thinnest of cartilage and skin. No one knew why he had decided to hang himself up there. He hadn't left a journal like the missing writer in my story, but he had a history of antidepressants and mental health issues. The owner of the cabin said he was glad to have finally found him, but I think I'll end my book a little differently. Even as I drive down the mountain, I can see the ending of the book coming together. The writer discovers a secret room where the realtor hides the bodies of the writers whose stories he steals, and the writer manages to fight him off before he becomes his last victim. Should be a good ending and a great story for the book circuit after I publish it. It isn't every day that you get to be part of a real-life mystery, after all.
It's always troublesome when the distractions seem to mount up and you just can't get your work done. Coming up next, we have an often visited story about a writer who finds his inspiration elsewhere. So let's hear a story about The Door.
I met my husband when we were in college together. I was working on my bachelor's degree, helping out in the library for some needed extra cash, when I first laid eyes on him. He was not the usual sort of man I fancied, more bookish than muscly. I found him charming in his own way, and we struck up a friendship. He told me he was a writer, that he was working on a book of short stories to submit to a publishing house. I offered to read them, and from that moment on, I became his biggest fan. His stories were so visceral. He wrote not as a writer, but as a first-hand observer, and it wasn't long before his work was noticed. We were living together by then, our library friendship having blossomed into something more, and I could see how giddy he was when the letters came in from Bowding Publishing. When he read how they wanted to publish his book, I think it was the proudest moment of his life. He kept writing for Bowding, his stories finding a niche with the horror community. He also started selling his pieces to magazines and online sources, getting his name out there and becoming more recognizable. As his fame grew, however, he still jokingly called me his biggest fan. I couldn't argue with him. I genuinely loved his work. He wrote the sort of stories that were genuinely terrifying and enticed the reader to keep reading until the very end. As his stories grew in number, I found myself curious about where they all came from. My husband, we'll call him Michael, was a mild-mannered fellow who had never really experienced anything horrifying in his life. He described his childhood as benign, no broken bones or funny uncles. His family was loving and doted on him constantly. He had never been without. He had never really suffered, and I found myself very curious about where all these nightmares came from in such a beautiful mind. Then, over drinks one night, he told me. He didn't like to talk about, where he got the stories from, not when he was sober. He always said that discussing the creative process was boring, or that his story's technical aspects would bore me to tears. I wasn't fooled, though. Beneath his jokes was something colder, something fearful. So one night I pressed him. He still didn't really want to talk about it, but I persisted. Finally, after a lot of coaxing and some strong whiskey, he all but blurted his answer to me. I wish now that I hadn't asked. "It's the door," he said, and at that moment he seemed almost afraid of his own words. The door? I was confused by the queerness of his answer. What do you dream about? He asked the question so suddenly, I was taken by surprise. Oh, I don't know. Normal things, I guess. What I did the day before, movies I've watched, weird things my mind cooks up. I've only ever had the same dream my entire life. It's always the same. It never changes. It's where I get all my ideas. I leaned forward, intrigued by what he was telling me. He seemed emboldened by my attention. The door lies in space. At least I believe it must be space. It floats in a great void, and every night I visit it. I float through this void naked, an umbilicus connecting me to whatever lies beyond. Every night I approach the door, and every night it whispers to me through the keyhole. Do you remember the little journal on my bedside? I nodded, begging him to go on with my eyes. I've trained myself to write the things I hear while sleeping. Sometimes I see pictures or faces when I look through the keyhole. Sometimes I hear terrible words spoken by creatures I imagine to be beyond my description. Sometimes I have to close my eyes and will myself awake because I'm afraid that the things they tell me will drive me insane. When I wake up, I read what I've written down, which becomes my stories. I was shocked. So all your stories come from this big door in space? He smiled at me. It sounds silly when you say it like that, but yes, everything I've ever written was spoken to me by something on the other side of that door. I didn't think anything of it the next day. We'd been drunk, and he had just spouted off something to make me shut up. I was sure of it. I became more aware of his journal, though. Sometimes at night he would wake me up with the scritch-scratch of his pen on the page. I didn't like to look at him when he was writing it. It was like something otherworldly had taken his strings and was using him without his permission. Watching him write in that fugue state made me feel uncomfortable, and I took measures not to be awake while it was going on. I didn't think anything else of this, not until about 3 months ago. That was when he started having the nightmares. His work had always been creepy, always terrifying, but now it took on an alarming quality. He began talking about creatures that lived beyond the door. These creatures sounded more than a little Lovecraftian, and he was assured that their presence on Earth was an affront to the natural order. They came and went, their arrivals marked by some with great portents, and their battles had shaped history. The stories weren't the only thing that changed, though. He began to sleep poorly. His sleep had always been placid, peaceful, but now he thrashed and mumbled in his sleep. He whimpered in the night about the pale lady or the green man and the riotous red that surged like blood. The words he wrote in his journal were unreadable, a foreign language, but he sat and scribbled them, transcribed them every morning like a dutiful follower of some religion. He began to change. His eyes bore huge bags. He was jumpy and unsure of himself, and more than once I caught him catnapping fitfully during the day. His writing, however, was more in demand than ever. The magazines he wrote for wanted more stories about these strange old ones. His editor wanted to publish a compilation of them at once. He had no lack of material for the book, but I began to get worried about his health as he proceeded. We had been married for 2 years then, just starting to make a life together, and I was afraid that his candle would burn out before mine. I asked him one night to stop writing the stories. He was at his computer, typing away dutifully, when I made the request. He turned his head to look at me, haunted eyes boring into mine, and laughed for the first time in weeks. It wasn't his laugh, though. The laughter was jagged and full of despair, humor shared only by the damned. He laughed like a madman. I can't. If I stop writing, they won't like it. Who? I asked in confusion. The ones behind the door. They've marked me as their chronicler. I can't stop until the job is done. These things are killing you. Can't you see that, Michael? He slumped over his keyboard, resting his head against it, making a line of letters as he did so. Don't you think I would if I could? If I could stop, I would give so much to stop. The things they tell me, no one should have to know these things. It's fruit from the poison tree, and I wish I did not have the knowledge that they've given me. Then stop, I said suddenly. Just stop writing. Tell them you refuse to write their story. He looked horrified. Refuse them? I've never refused a story before. What if it stops the door from working? I turned him in his chair and pulled him to me. The door is in your mind, love. The way it manifests is nothing more than your own mind working through your stories. The monsters are of your own making. You control them. They don't control you. At that moment, he looked relieved. He hugged me back and seemed on the verge of tears. I don't think he had ever thought of those nightly excursions as anything but in a literal sense. He had never imagined that these things could be of his own creation, and the knowledge had made him feel free. I'll tell them tonight, then, he said with a smile on his face. I'll tell them that I don't want to write about them anymore. I'll tell Fred that I don't want to continue these stories in the morning. He won't like it, but he'll understand. He went to bed then, and I figured that would be the end of the nightmares. I was wrong. He woke me in the middle of the night, screaming. The back of his hand hit me in the face, and I rolled awake to the sound of him screaming. He was thrashing around, clutching his stomach and kicking his legs frantically. I tried to wake him. I know everything says not to do that, but I wanted him to wake up. I slapped his face. I threw water on him. I screamed his name, but nothing worked. Someone banged on the door, but I ignored them. I tried in every way I could to help my husband. Finally, he helped himself. We were in the ER. The knocking person had called the paramedics, and they had burst in. They thought someone was being murdered, but they loaded him up and took him straight to the hospital when they saw what was going on. He lay in an ER bed, screaming and kicking until they finally restrained him. He went right on thrashing and yelling until nearly 4 a.m. Then he gasped loudly, like a diver coming up from a deep depth, and seemed to come awake. "They cut my umbilicus," he said in a tone of the most profound sorrow. They moved him upstairs later that day. The doctor who talked to him was afraid that he might hurt himself, and I was a little worried too. For the next 2 days, he sat strapped to a hospital bed, fighting sleep. He couldn't sleep, he told me, because he would have no way back without his umbilicus. I would be lost forever, and my consciousness would float forever in that void. He told me how he had told the thing behind the door that he would no longer write its story. I had assured him that it was all in his head, that it was a product of his imagination. When it had burst through the door and screamed, he knew it was all too real. He had run then, fled across the void, but the creature had wings and it had chased him. It defies description. Its legs were equine, its head like living rock. Its body was made of stars. I don't know, dear. Its mouth was full of fiery teeth, and when it lunged at me, I could do nothing but flee. As he had run, the thing had slashed at him. The clawed hand had torn at his umbilicus. Michael said a pain like a rending scythe had torn through his belly, and as he writhed, he could see the fiery teeth sever the root from him. He had caught the end then, using the last of his strength to grab the trailing end, and pulled himself out of the dark place, a little at a time. He was afraid after that, afraid to go back, afraid of what might be waiting there for him. He fought sleep for the next 3 days. He would nod and awaken, but it seemed harder for him to come back every time. He begged his doctor for caffeine pills, for coffee, for anything to keep him awake, but the doctors thought sleep would be the best drug for him. They fiddled with the idea of sedating him, but I forbade it. When they threatened to get the police involved, thinking I was somehow responsible for this, I threatened to call a lawyer. Finally, we reached a shaky standoff. It was moot after day 3. I lost the fight first, drifting off as I sat by his bedside. When I awoke, he was gone. He's in the ICU now. His coma is deep, and the doctors are afraid he might have suffered a stroke. They don't know about his nightly travels. Wouldn't believe me if I told them. But I know what's been happening to him. He's adrift in the void now, maybe already dead at the hands of this elder thing, and there's nothing I can do to get him back. But maybe there is something you all can do. My husband could not be the only one traveling to this place. Some of you must have heard the whispers through the door as well. If you see this door, and if you find my husband, please bring him back. I don't know how you would, but please try. And if the creatures on the other side of the door talk to you about things from the other side, please do yourself a favor and listen to them. Don't ever stop listening to them. I wish I had never told him to stop listening. The price you pay for ignoring them might be your life. The price might even be steeper than that.
It's always strange, the places where we find inspiration sometimes, even if it's in our dreams. Coming up next, we have a story about a man seeking inspiration outside of his dreams, and in something a little odd, a sickness, in fact. So let's hear a story about fever dreams.
I looked at the ad, unsure if my fever-addled brain was reading it right. Wanted, someone to infect me with the COVID-19 virus. Must be verified as sick, have paperwork verifying illness no older than 2 days from today's date, and be willing to allow me to spend time near them. Will pay $500 for 8 hours in your company. Contraction of virus notwithstanding. Please email me immediately, with an email address attached. I had only been infected by the virus for the last 3 days, but I had been affected by it for the last 2 months. I had been laid off from work after a drop in profits had caused the store to go into bankruptcy. My boss had been very apologetic, but he still hadn't been able to keep the doors open. We had all hit the unemployment line after that, but unemployment wasn't as good as overtime. I'll admit, I had been living a little outside my means, and the bills were starting to pile up. Getting sick had ended my job search, and $500 was going to go a long way to settling my debt and keeping the lights on. And all that for letting a stranger hang out in my house for 8 hours sounded like a dream come true. I contacted him, and he offered to come over that very night, cash in hand. We discussed hours. I'm a dedicated night owl, and he agreed to come over at about 6 p.m. His knock dragged me out of my stupor at around 5:45, and I staggered up to get the door. I didn't expect to be greeted by a well-dressed man in his mid-30s. I'd expected a weirdo, maybe some disease fetishist who got off on being sick, but this guy was surprisingly well put together. He wore black slacks, a button-down shirt, no mask, and his brown hair was close-cropped with a square pair of little gold glasses that made him look like a banker. He shook my hand, something no one had done in a while, and took an envelope of money out of his pocket. He showed me 5 crisp $100 bills, and then I led him into the living room. He sat in my armchair, leaning in close as I sagged back onto the couch and stared at me intently. "So, what do we do now?" I asked. He shrugged. "Just whatever you usually do. Watch TV, play video games, whatever. Hopefully my proximity will be all it takes to get the disease, and I'll achieve my goal." "I had wondered about that," I said, sneezing into a Kleenex and wincing as he leaned in closer. "This disease is supposed to be pretty bad. Why exactly do you want it?" "I'd tell you, but honestly it would sound crazy," he said with a chuckle. I shrugged. "It's not like we got anything else to do but watch Netflix for 8 hours. Tell me, it'll make the time pass." He glanced over at my bookshelf, eyes roaming as though he was looking for something particular, before settling on and taking a paperback from the middle. It was a newer book, Fields of the Foregone, and he nodded as he inspected the spine. He must have liked what he saw because he smiled and held the book out to me. "I see you're a fan of my work. I'll sign it for you if you want, but my books are part of the reason I'm here." I squinted at him. Are you Timothy Corvin? The guy who writes the Ghostgrass series?" He nodded. "Yep, 3-time New York Times bestseller." I gaped at him for a few seconds before asking my next question. "Why the hell are you at my apartment trying to get sick?" He smiled, but the smile was sad. "You could say that the writing is why I'm here." He sat down again and made himself comfortable before telling me the strangest story I'd ever heard. "I got sick about a month ago. It came on quickly, cough, fever, typical flu-like symptoms. But I assured my agent that it wouldn't be an issue. I'd finish my latest novel and have it on her desk by the end of the month. First couple of days weren't so bad. I was still lucid, and I managed to get some work done. I was trucking right along, making good progress, when the real sickness hit. Suddenly I was feverish, scatterbrained, and I could hardly focus long enough to get off the couch. I spent my days in a stupor, high on cold medicine and barely coherent. My nights consisted of rolling around in a fever-fueled daze that made me question whether I was dreaming or awake. I had these dreams, you see. I say dreams because I can't remember them, but I couldn't do anything but remember them then. I would sit on the couch and mumble about them all day, reeling through their world as I tried to wrap my head around them. I raised an eyebrow at him. "It sounds pretty bad. Sounds like you didn't get a lot done." "Oh, quite the contrary. The longer I raved about the stories, the more I started to write about them. Not so much writing, I guess. I read through my notes the other day, and it was more like drunken ramblings. At some point, I moved on to chronicling them. I would come to at my computer, banging away at a story, not sure what I was doing or how long I'd been doing it. The stories were great, but they were so far outside of what I normally did that I couldn't wrap my incoherent brain around them. As the fever started getting worse, I would slip into these fugue states and just write for hours on end. One day I came out of one and found I had an email from my agent. I had sent her a draft for one of the stories. I was so worried. These stories were really weird, completely batty, and I was afraid that she would drop me as a client if she read what my fever-swallowed brain had cooked up. He took a sip from his coffee then, wetting his pipes, and my own fever-addled brain became a little impatient. "So, what did she think?" "Oh, she loved it. She said it was the most unique thing she had ever read, the most unique thing she had read in ages, and wanted to know when I was going to be done with it. Reading through what I had sent her and the stuff I was working on before I got better, I can see what she was talking about. It is both similar to so many things and completely different. It's a timeless story that sits completely outside of the normal processes. It seems to contain two antagonists and no hero, a war with nothing but loss and stakes that don't seem to make any sense. It was almost Lovecraftian, and I found myself as interested in hearing how it turned out as she was. But that was where the problem arose. He looked at my glass of water longingly, and I slid it across the table to him. If he wanted to get sick, then more power to him. He was paying after all, so he might as well get his money's worth. He reached out and brought it to his lips, throat working as he swallowed. I tried not to gag. There was probably backwash in that. My meds were squashing the fever that was keeping my brain in its altered state of mind. I was always careful never to ride it for too long, but the high was more than a little intoxicating. I would time travel in those moments, starting on my couch and coming to at my computer as I finished more pages than I'd ever done. I throttled back on my meds a little, wanting to stretch this out for as long as I could, but eventually my body started to get better. My fugue states became fewer and fewer. I found that I couldn't tap into that hidden world, and the story wasn't something that I could just make up as I went along. It was unknown, unheard of, and my mind couldn't begin to tap into that place by itself. My agent was wild to have more, wanting an ending, wanting a sequel, and that's when I started thinking about contracting it again. I lifted an eyebrow at him. I know that's what brought you here, that's what you told me on the phone, but I still have a hard time believing that you want this crap. It's miserable. Between the headaches and the near constant fever, I seem to mostly exist in a state of misery. Some people are experiencing it even worse than I have. What if you get the kind that's really bad and you're hospitalized? It seems like that would put a damper on your writing. He shrugged. That's the thing. Even when I'm experiencing the same symptoms as you, I still get the urge to write. I don't know if it's subconscious or what, but my brain takes over and forces my body to keep writing. Maybe it's not even my conscious mind. Maybe it's this place, and I've been tapped when I'm in these fugue states. I've had this thing 3 times now, you know. If I had had water in my hand, I would have probably did a spit take. 3 times? My God, you rarely hear of anybody getting it more than twice. After I got better the first time, I was struggling to keep up, he said, suddenly looking far away. I tried faking it, but it just wasn't the same. My agent started to notice. She started to send my stuff back with notes like, I need more of the voice you had in the first draft. I started getting desperate. She told me that she shared my notes with some of her colleagues, and they were very excited about how it was all coming together. So I started putting the pieces together and decided that I needed to recreate the situation. You needed to get sick again, I said. He nodded. I needed to get sick again. I started slowly, waiting in hospitals and waiting rooms, looking for sick people, but I became desperate after a while. I got lucky the first time, a chance encounter with a sick friend. One trip to their apartment, and I was back where I started, feverish and coughing on my couch as I waited for the time skips to start. Did they? Would I still be running the ad if they hadn't? This time, though, something was different. This time I was treated to some of the most vivid dreams I've ever had. I wasn't just hearing about my 2 antagonists. I could see them. I watched them play their shadow games, maneuver their pieces, snatch territory only to lose it again. All the while I was chronicling them. It became a mania for me. I refused to take anything to dull the fever this time, but it didn't seem to matter. After a week, my fever was abating, and I was back to trying to fake it. But I couldn't fake it. I wouldn't even try. I needed the dreams. I needed the visions. I needed the writing fits that I never remembered. That was when I started running the ads. The lady at the paper didn't want to run them at first. She said I was sick, but once I offered to pay her triple the going rate, she caved. As I watched him talk about it, I reflected that he did look pretty sick. Not physically, but mentally, I mean. He looked like an addict describing his favorite drug. As he talked, he scratched at his arm, his face taking on a smiling rictus as he described the visions. I began to wonder just how this disease, or maybe it was the story that had affected him. I wanted to tell him to leave off for his own good, but I really did need the money. I've sunk nearly $5,000 into getting this disease. Did I tell you that? Every time I post the ad, someone responds. After so many, though, my body has built up antibodies to it, and every time I get it, it's a little less effective. The last time I contracted it, I barely had it for a week. I was so anxious to get any work out of it that I don't think I got more than 30 pages the whole week. 30 pages? I gasped. I was no writer, but that seemed like a prolific amount of work for a sick person. I know. What a disgrace. The first time I was nearly averaging 30 pages a day, but after the first time I never managed it again. You were getting that much a day? His eyes glazed a little. He didn't seem pleased with what he saw, and he looked at my popcorn ceiling. I see them constantly. I simply can't make sense of it on my own. I can't convey something like storms battling for supremacy, tectonic plates crashing against each other as they try to change the land. Their fugues allow me to tap into something primal that could understand these ideas. My puny lizard brain just can't make anything out of it. You know, reading these things I've written, understanding only enough of what I've written, scares me a little. How much of your book have you written? I asked, not sure I wanted an answer. He scratched again, still uncomfortable, but wanting to discuss his drug of choice nonetheless. I've written 5 books. I've cataloged the lives of these two from the moment of their birth to the very last encounter they had directly. I gaped at him. He was talking about 5 books in what must have been a matter of months. I couldn't even consider something like that, and I began to wonder how large they were. The pages, the volume he was talking about per day surely meant that these were no small books. He didn't seem to understand where these stories were coming from either, which made them all the more mysterious and unknown. Can you tell me about them? He gave me a dead-eyed look, and I almost regretted asking. It's not something people really want to know in the end. This little experiment started as a way to write the next great fantasy series, but my agent stopped returning my emails about 3 weeks ago. The last 2 endeavors have been solely so I could learn how it ends, how we end. We? Humanity. We are the ultimate prize that these 2 creatures fight over. More specifically, they fight over the right to subjugate and entertain themselves with us. We see their battles as normal. We see their battles as nothing but the changing of the seasons, but they see them as nothing short of war. I can tell you, but you won't want to know once I'm done. I didn't really want to know anymore, but I felt like I had to know. In the end, my curiosity was stronger than my fear. He spent the next 10 hours telling me about the battle between the Green Man and the Pale Lady. He told me of their beginnings in Strange, their emergence, and their eventual exile, and how they came to be on this plane of existence in the first place. He told me about the Brandylow, the servants of the Pale Lady, and the numerous agents of the Green Man. He told me how this green warrior was worshipped as a pagan deity, how he took his sacrifices, and how he sought out those who ran. It's funny how 10 hours can seem like a half hour when someone is telling you about the eldritch deities that you never knew you wanted to know about. When the alarm on my phone went off, reminding me to take my meds, I realized that it was 6 a.m. and the sun was coming up. Timothy got up, checking his own phone, and seemed to realize that he'd been talking all night. Seems I've gone over my time a little. Here, as promised, he said, taking out the money and handing it to me as he left. Wait, I said, dropping the envelope and coming shakily from the couch. How does it end? He looked back and shrugged. Hopefully I'll find out. If I do, I'll let you know. Then he left, and I wouldn't hear from him for another 3 months. Well, I'd never hear from him again, but he would make good on his promise. I felt better by the end of the week, my fever breaking and my headache getting better and better. I finally acquired a negative test and started looking for work again. I got lucky. The bar up the road was hiring, and they needed someone to start right away. They had only recently been allowed to reopen, and the bartender was working double duty as the barback to help out. Before I knew it, I was bussing tables and hauling kegs like an old pro. I enjoyed the work. though it wasn't something I'd ever done before, and it felt nice to get back to work after a long absence. Then, one afternoon, I was helping my boss open, flipping on the TV and preparing to tune in to one of the sports channels like I often did. That's when I saw the little squib on the news that made me stop. The city is mourning the death of local writer Timothy Corvin, who died of COVID-related symptoms in St. Graham's this morning. Mr. Corvin, the writer of the Ghostgrass series, is survived by his father and his older sister. Service will be held Tuesday for his friends and family at... I couldn't believe it. The guy had been in my house not even a month ago. Had I killed him? Had he contracted his fatal disease from me? I had to sit down. I didn't know what to make of it. My boss must have noticed that something was off because he tried to send me home, wondering if I still had some latent symptoms of being sick. I told him I was fine, though, and I went back to work. As I worked, I wondered if he'd discovered the end he was looking for. I got my answer in the mail a couple of months later. A package was waiting on the stoop. I hadn't ordered anything, and the return address was from Samantha Drummond. The delivery address was mine, though, so I brought it inside and opened it. Inside was a manuscript, bound in twine with no title across the surface. On the top of the journal was a typed note from Mrs. Drummond informing me of her package's purpose. "Hello. My brother requested that I send this to you after he passed. He was very adamant that it be placed in your care. All the best, Mrs. Drummond." I lifted out the journal, opening the front page and bearing a message written in a shaky hand. "I found the end. Let's hope it helps you after I'm gone. I've been sitting here looking at the book for close to an hour, not sure whether I should read it or just burn it. If the beings Timothy had talked about had been using his infected body as a mouthpiece, I'm not sure I want to open my mind to them. This book contains their history, contains their past, present, and future, and this knowledge was gained at the cost of a life. Will they come to infect me if I subject myself to this arcane wisdom? That knowledge scares me more than a little as I put the journal back in the box and carry it to my room. I decided to put it in the closet for now. Some things are better left unknown, I think."
One more story for you, and I promise I've saved a pretty good one for last. Let's hear a story about a writer whose writing career lasts long after death. Let's hear a story about the tapping of the keys.
My dad died nearly 2 years ago, and we just buried him today. He was a writer, though you've probably never heard of him. He was known in small circles, celebrated by the community where he lived, but his books will likely never grace the shelves of Barnes & Nobles. I say that like it's a fact, but that may not be the case anymore. Dad, much like one of those painters from the 1800s, became infinitely more famous in his death than he ever was in life. People who wouldn't return his calls, wouldn't even think of publishing his work, now come to see him from miles away. This probably seems strange, given that I just told you that he's dead, so let me start at the beginning. Dad died as he lived, at his keyboard. He's been writing the same book for as long as I can remember. It's a massive 7 or 8 volume series. In one of my earliest memories, I can remember toddling into his office and looking up at him as he smiled down at me, his fingers never leaving the keyboard as he plinked away. Dad wrote other things for magazines or freelance work, but the books were his magnum opus. He would tell anyone who would listen, usually interested friends of mine who were aspiring writers themselves, how the book would be the greatest work once it was done. He had envisioned 10 books in all, detailing the hero's journey of his main character as he attempted to find his father's murderer across several continents, meeting people and finding clues along the way. I've heard him talk about that book almost every day since I was old enough to understand what he was talking about, but I couldn't tell you much about them. He never let anybody read them. He was so protective of them. I don't know more than a dozen people who were aware of its existence at all. That being said, he was always in his study when he had time, tapping away at the keys and refining his manuscript for the day that it would be picked up by an editor. I was the one who found him, and it will haunt me for the rest of my life. I was getting ready for college, packing up my things, moving out, and I came to see if he would help me move some furniture onto the truck. He'd been in his office all day, and I kind of thought maybe he was mad at me. I know he didn't want me to leave. He was sad to see me go, but he had to understand that I had to go to college. I had a full-ride scholarship. I'd be a fool not to use it. And living on campus would give me access to resources I wouldn't have at home. It seemed like the best choice to move out, and I couldn't believe he couldn't see that. So when I stuck my head in and asked him, I was surprised when he didn't turn around. That only seemed to cement in my head the idea that he was mad at me. He had his back to the door, as he always did, fingers tapping away, and when he didn't say anything, I just stood there and looked at the back of his head for a moment. He had a bald spot forming, the hair receding away from the center, and I thought it was a little sad to watch my dad aging in such an obvious way. I asked him again, his fingers never slowing, but when he didn't say anything, I just went downstairs and managed to manhandle the desk into the U-Haul by myself. I decided I wouldn't bother him if he wanted to act like this. He would fold when it came time for me to leave, apologizing for acting like this, and we would have a hug before I drove off into the sunset. Around lunchtime, I looked at my now empty room and realized I was finished packing. Mom was at work at the post office, and I had planned to swing in and say bye on my way out of town. We had said our goodbyes that morning, with a lot of tears and hugging over breakfast, and Dad was the only one I still needed to say goodbye to. So I went upstairs again, saying I needed to leave and wondering if he'd give me a hug. His fingers just kept tapping away uninterrupted. "Come on, Dad," I said, stepping inside as he continued to ignore me. "I know you're bummed about this, but it's time for me to get out of here and make my own way. It's not like I'll never see you again. I'll be here for Thanksgiving. That's less than..." But when I put my hand on his shoulder, I noticed how cold it was. Dad had been up here for 3 days writing, and Mom said she didn't think he'd come to bed in all that time. That wasn't uncommon for Dad. He would hyperfixate on a project, or revisions for days at a time. His office was towards the back of the house on the second floor, so without foot traffic or noise, he could lose himself for days as he worked. He usually came down for food after everyone was asleep, but I couldn't remember hearing him stumble around lately. I turned him towards me, his hands moving comically in front of him as he swung away from the desk, and as he came away, he began to scream as if someone was stabbing him. I stumbled away, taking in his long face and sunken eyes, and found myself running from the room as I grabbed the phone out of my pocket. Mom said she'd be home immediately, and as I waited downstairs, I could still hear him screaming in his office. She came home in a rush, going up the stairs 2 at a time, and when the screaming finally stopped, I breathed a sigh of relief. When she came downstairs, she asked me to come to his office. "I need to talk to you about something, and I think this should be a family decision." I came back to see that Dad was still staring at the screen of his MacBook, tapping away like we weren't even there. "I don't know how to explain this, but your father's dead." Looking at his fingers as they went about their tireless typing, I asked if she was kidding. Dad was clearly alive. His hands were moving, and I could see words on the screen forming coherent sentences. Were they playing a joke or something? None of what she was saying made any sense. I checked his pulse. He has no pulse, no vitals. He's gone, sweetie. But it appears that he's not quite gone. She tried to move him, and as she turned him away from the computer, I could see his lifeless face as it turned to regard me. His jaw had been hanging slack, his eyes open and staring, and as his hands came away from the keyboard, he started screaming all over again. It was deep and tortured, similar to the one he'd made before, and without even meaning to, I turned him back to the keyboard where his hands started typing again. I asked her what was going on, and Mom shrugged as she tried to come up with a reason for this. His book was important to him. You know that. I think maybe once he finishes it, he might stop on his own. I can't explain what's happening here, but I don't want him to die with his work unfinished. Your father kept saying it wasn't ready, but I'm going to send the first manuscript to his editor. Maybe once he sees it and someone puts it into print, he'll finally be able to rest. Either way, let's keep this between us, okay? I want your father to pass on without regrets, don't you? I nodded, telling her of course I did. I wanted Dad to die in peace. Then do him this last favor, and don't tell anyone what you've seen here. Promise? I really didn't know how to feel about this, but I told her I wouldn't tell anyone, and she thanked me as she hugged me goodbye. I left in my U-Haul, unsure how to feel about the situation, but I kept the secret. I didn't come home for the next year. I came home for Thanksgiving, as promised, but the whole thing felt uncomfortable. Mom and I sat downstairs eating, her curious about how school was going, and me filling her in on my studies. As I ate turkey and tried to have a normal conversation over stuffing, all I could focus on was the tap, tap, tapping from upstairs. Mom had closed the door to Dad's office, something that I could never remember happening at any time in my life. But despite her best efforts, the tapping was still audible. There was a smell from the room at the end of the hall, and I was worried about her living in a house with a decomposing body. She said he hadn't decomposed much, but I think she might have been trying to spare my feelings. Worse than the smell, though, was the tapping. It never stopped. It sounded too loud to be from whole fingers. Despite this, Mom was in pretty good spirits. She said that Dad's first book was being edited, and his publicist thought it was likely to be ready for shelves by next year. He couldn't believe my dad had been keeping this gem to himself for so long, and I think that's when I really realized how few people Dad had shared his book with. She said the initial payment on the book had allowed her to pay some overdue bills, and she would send him the second book sometime next year. If I release them slowly, it won't seem so odd when he finishes, and I let them know that he's passed. I asked if his writing had slowed at all, and she said that he was typing all day and night. He never rests, and I've had to start sleeping in my noise-canceling headphones. The sound takes some getting used to, but I think I can put it out of my mind. I had meant to stay the week, but I ended up making excuses and leaving the day after Thanksgiving. The sound of the keys as they clicked away was becoming too much for me to handle. After that, I made excuses not to come home. I told Mom I had a paper due during Christmas and stayed on campus over the holiday. I took extra classes so I didn't have to come home on the semesters that I'd be able to take a break from. I still called her on the phone, but her conversations became shorter and shorter as time went on. The longer I was on the line with her, the more pervasive the clicking became, and it felt like I could hear it over the phone no matter where she was. Mom's mental state began to deteriorate as well. She'd sent the second book to his publicist, and he'd fast-tracked it after the first one had done so well. She deflected any sort of interviews or phone calls for Dad, telling them how shy and anxious he was. But people really seemed to want to pick his brain about the direction of the books, and they were becoming harder and harder to put off. She didn't sound like her usual self either. It was clear that she wasn't sleeping. She said the clicking was getting louder and louder the longer it went on. I tried to do some soundproofing on the office, but it never seems to help. I can't stand to be in there for very long. Even though he's looking at the screen, I can feel him watching me when I'm in there. I think I can hear something moving around at night, too. Mom took a deep breath, and I could almost see her looking in the direction of the office as she pitched her voice lower. I asked what she meant, afraid that maybe animals had gotten in to try to get at Dad's body. But she said it was just little sounds. You remember how he used to leave his office late at night to get food? Sometimes I feel like I can hear someone coming down the stairs in the wee hours of the morning. While I was listening to it the other night, I realized that I couldn't hear the keyboard anymore, and that scared me even more. She started crying then, and I think I had already decided to come home that weekend so we could sort this out. I hadn't come home in a long time, and I found a very different woman than the one I had found over Thanksgiving a year before. And why not? It had to be nerve-wracking, knowing you were sharing a house with a corpse. Mom looked like she had aged 20 years. Her hair, light blonde the last time I'd seen it, was threaded with gray and looked thinner than ever. Her skin sagged, and her eyes looked bruised from the bags under them. She was so thin to the point of emaciation, and I wondered if she had been eating. When she hugged me, I could feel her ribs pressing against me, and I decided then that something had to be done before I lost both my parents. I told her that we had to end this. I told her that we had to put him to rest, but she feebly resisted. He isn't done yet. He's still typing up there. I can't lay him to rest until he's finished. I asked her how long that would be, but she didn't seem to have an answer. I told her I was tired and wanted to rest, but after I heard her door close and the sound of her springs grumbling as she went to bed, I got up and went downstairs. I wanted to see what this thing was that was moving around after dark, and I knew just the place to hide. There was a small closet in the living room, a place for wrapping paper and old crafts Mom hadn't gotten around to yet. And after sliding some things around, I made myself comfortable and cracked the door. It took some time. I wished I had some coffee to keep me from dozing in the small, warm place. I was just starting to nod off, my phone showing 3:30 in the morning, when the landing at the top of the stairs creaked. Something glided down almost soundlessly, its body light as I pressed my eye to the slit in the door to see what it was. It was dark in the living room, the curtains drawn, but I didn't dare turn on my light. If it knew I was here, it might flee, and then I'd have nothing to report to Mom in the morning. Luckily for me, it jostled right past the closet door, and the creature was impossible to miss. It was thin, almost lacking dimensions, creaking as it ambled into the kitchen. I held my breath as it disappeared into the dim space, but the pale head was hard to miss. When it turned to look at the closet from the kitchen doorway, I feared I'd made a noise. When those empty eye sockets fixed on the door, I covered my mouth with my hands. When the creature creaked its way into the kitchen and disappeared from sight, I tripped out of the closet and made my way less than gracefully back up the stairs and into my old room. If it heard me, it didn't stop at the door to comment. Only then did I come to the same conclusion that my mother had, realizing what was missing from the silent house. The tapping had stopped. We called the police the next day, me threatening to call them myself if Mom didn't. I didn't know what that thing was I'd seen the night before in the kitchen, but I couldn't very well leave her alone with it. She just nodded and picked up the phone. I think she was ready to call them, honestly. She lived with Dad's corpse for 2 years, and even she had to agree it was time to end it. The paramedics weren't sure what to make of him, but he was definitely what I had seen the night before when it came into the kitchen. He had almost completely rotted, but his bones had moldering flesh still attached in places. His scalp had some hair clinging to it. The bald spot I had noticed was still visible, but we had taken his hands off the keyboard before they got there. When we had taken him from the computer, his scream was little more than a wheeze of protest. He had no vocal cords to scream with, but still, he protested. The police had questions, but I think Mom managed to convince them that it was all harmless. She said that when he died, she had just gone a little bit crazy. She couldn't cope with him being gone, so she just pretended he was in his office, typing away on his novel. I told them that that was what she had told me for months, and I think they believed me. Dad's remains were taken to the funeral home, and it goes without saying that his funeral was a closed casket affair. As we sat on the front row, though, I heard something that would haunt me until I went into the ground myself. Dad may not have been able to scream, but it seemed his work went on regardless. As I sat there with Mom, my mother sobbing as she heard the all-too-familiar sound, we both heard the low tapping of those bony fingers smacking against the lid of the coffin. I can only assume that they still press against the lid even now, my father's last story worn into the wood of his coffin.
And just like that, our stories are over for another day. I do hope you'll join us tomorrow for more cozy horror with yours truly. Until then, this is Dr. Plague wishing you a wonderful day and a spooky evening.